As the Trump administration continues to refuse to provide the names of those who received PPP loans, friend of the show and Jacobin editor-at-large David Sirota is revealing that a new group is trying to get a payday from Washington, and that is private equity firms.
They're always trying to get a payday from Washington, as an Employee Benefits Security Administration information letter was released allowing employers to invest their employees' retirement funds with high-risk private equity funds, a practice that, according to one expert that David Sirota cites, could result in at least a $435 billion windfall for those private equity firms. David joins us now via Skype to share more. Great to see you, David.
Good to see you.
All right, so while much of America was focused on the incredibly important conversation about Donald Trump walking down a ramp, this is what you were digging into. Just give us the highlights here.
Yeah, explain it a little bit.
Private equity has sought to get access to the 401k and the IRA market for many, many years. Defined contribution plans, as opposed to defined benefit plans. Right now, pension funds and university endowments can invest, and they do invest a lot of money in private equity, but private equity wants access to the trillions of dollars that workers have saved in 401ks, and they've been pushing for that for a really long time, including the person who's spoken out very, very explicitly on this is a guy named Steve Schwarzman, the billionaire CEO of Blackstone, which is the world's biggest private equity firm. Steve Schwarzman also happens to be a top advisor to Donald Trump. He ran one of the outside counsels for Trump of business executives, very, very close to Trump. He's been pushing for it for years. He actually said at one point that getting a president who would support allowing private equity to have access to 401ks, that would be his dream. And what happened was that the Department of Labor actually issued a letter very quietly saying that private equity can now have access to 401k plans and IRAs. The reason it was outlawed in the past, and that's the important point, the reason it was outlawed is because private equity investments are opaque, they are high risk, and they come with huge fees. There was a new study that came out days after this letter came out, the study that said that private equity moguls had raked in $230 billion of fees over the last decade alone. Fees from, again, investors like pension funds and university endowments. So now you have a situation where corporations are empowered by the Trump administration to move workers' 401k money into private equity investments.
So, David, one of the things I've also tracked here very closely is that private equity funds and I think venture capitalists as well have been trying hard to get PPP loans. And that one of the things that they're trying very desperately is in order to kind of knock away any sort of barriers that they've had from manipulating or possibly, getting involved with regular worker funds. And that this rescission of this element of this provision of the law could lead that to happen. So what is the worst case scenario and what is the best case scenario for a change like this?
The worst case scenario is that this change moves a lot of money into private equity firms. Private equity firms make huge fees off of that money, and the private equity firms don't deliver returns that are significantly better than funds that are low-fee index funds. What I didn't say in the other answer was in making $230 billion in fees, the private equity firms did not deliver overall better results than a low-fee stock index fund. It's one thing to pay lots of fees to get much bigger returns than, let's say, an S&P 500 fund can return. It's another thing for investors to pay huge amounts of fees and then at the end of the day get basically weak returns that they could have gotten had they invested in a low-fee index fund. So that's
right.
The worst case scenario for workers. The best case scenario, I guess, is that private equity funds do deliver better returns than the stock market, and that these investments are worthwhile for everyone. Yes, they're high fee. Yes, they make private equity firms a lot of money, but they also make workers a lot of money. But again, the past doesn't suggest that those fees end up being really worth it.
Yeah, based on what we've seen in the past, you're basically talking about huge fees. It's like the worst of all worlds, high risk and low return, which is like the exact opposite of what you ultimately want. David, you're there in Colorado, and I know you follow progressive races across the country, but I particularly wanted to get your insights into the Senate primary that is going on there. John Hickenlooper, a very centrist corporatist type of candidate, has of course gotten all the establishment backing in the Senate primary. It looked like he was really marching on the path to victory, like he wasn't going to have that tough of a fight on his hands. But here down the stretch, a progressive candidate, Andrew Romanoff, really seems to be closing the gap. Can you just give us some of the outlines of that race?
Sure. John Hickenlooper, two-term governor of Colorado, ran for president, kind of embarrassed himself, didn't do very well, said he never wanted to run for the Senate. Then Chuck Schumer essentially recruited him into the race. The DSCC endorsed him. It was a multi-candidate race at that point. Andrew Romanoff, the former House Speaker, a much more progressive candidate, was one of those candidates. Hickenlooper gets recruited into the race. Hickenlooper spent the presidential campaign vilifying progressives, opposing Medicare for all, opposing a Green New Deal. Andrew Romanoff, pro-Medicare for all, pro-Green New Deal. Hickenlooper had been cruising for a while, raising lots of money, and then all of a sudden in the last few weeks, everything's kind of gotten a little wild. Hickenlooper defied a subpoena at one point. He was under investigation for violating the state's ethics laws, its gift rules, and an independent state panel, including one of his appointees that is on that panel, found that he violated our state's cornerstone anti-corruption law. Then a story came out showing that Hickenlooper had accepted, his gubernatorial office had accepted oil and gas money into the actual gubernatorial office while it was making a policy about oil and gas. Then a quote came out of Hickenlooper essentially likening himself to a slave on a slave ship, an old video from about 6 years ago. Point is that the campaign is really if not collapsed, run into a lot of turbulent waters. And Romanoff has been arguing that essentially this is not only bad on the merits, but it actually endangers the Democratic Party's ability to win a seat in a Democratic-leaning state that they need to win to win control of the Senate. It's a Republican-held seat right now, but it is considered one of the most winnable Senate seats in the country for Democrats. But the argument by Romanoff is that if Hickenlooper ends up being the nominee with all these scandals, it could help the Republicans retain the seat.
Wow. Well, sounds like a hot mess, as I heard it was described by Romanoff's by Hickenlooper's campaign itself. All right.
Never a good sign.
Thanks,
Thank you, David. Great to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you guys.
Next on Rising, John Bolton's book is out. The revelations in it might say a bit more about Bolton than the president. And Pushback host Aaron Mate, he's going to share his takes on it when Rising continues.